Hi everyone, welcome. Let's start again with the afternoon. I hope you had a little bit of coffee because there will be a few equations in my slides, but we're going to start soft. So we're here today to talk about classification error and biases and how can we make them understandable and transparent, especially to people who don't have a lot of expertise in machine learning, like your end users. So let me introduce myself. I'm an eccentric person, a flake, an oddball, and a geek who characterize that like me. So I've been classified by a system that has been trained on ImageNet. It was a system made by Kate Crawford from the AI Now Institute. And it was using these crowdsourced images of people where anybody could put a label on people. And it was, of course, very biased and sometimes offensive. And this was to tell the general public this system where you could upload a picture of you and see how you would be classified using this data set. It was meant to tell the public how we are being classified today and how biased or racist or sexist those kind of classifications can be. And there's been a lot of headlines in the news about the damage that those bias systems can do. So here we have a combination of two examples. This shows you the performances of gender classifiers, and we can see that they work much better for male than for female, and they work much better for white-skinned people than dark-skinned people. So if you're female with dark skin, then you have much more errors. That's what we can see with those bars there. And on top of that, I've run these images through the person classifiers from Kate Crawford that classified me earlier. And here you can see what kind of biased and racist label we can end up having. So the first black male has been classified as a rape suspect. I won't comment on that. I think it talks for itself. The black female has been classified as a prophetess, and it still is a little bit like racist and offensive, with something exotic about that person. And the two white people have been classified as policy holder. And when you read the description, it means people who own assets. So I think just this example gives you quite a nice view of the problem we have now with classification biases. So they can be racist and sexist, and sometimes also the applications are very dubious. Here's an example where we're trying to classify people's sexual orientation. We're trying to guess if you're gay or not, and not if you're bisexual, but anyway, if you're gay or not, just based on the features of your face, which can be really problematic because it's very close to what we used to do in the 40s, up until the 40s, in a branch of psychology called phrenology. And it was considered as real science in psychology, where there was a science of how the features of people's faces would predict their characters and their ability, their intelligence, their suitability for different types of jobs. And it was embedding all our cultural biases in some form of pseudoscience. So here it's from a book about phrenology, and we can learn how to distinguish people that are honest or dishonest. So if you have a crooked nose, you're obviously dishonest. And that's actually just encoding our social cultural biases. And the only thing that defeated phrenology back then was to debunk it by analyzing its errors. So you could say, like, listen, that's not a science. If you test it, if you look at the errors, what you predict is not matching reality. So it took 70 years to get rid of these kind of approaches. And nowadays, with our computer vision system or other kinds of classifiers, we're kind of falling into the same trap because we're using whatever features that we have as a proxy for reality. And then it might make errors. There are spurious correlations, for instance. And the only way that we can combat this kind of situation is by analyzing the errors and the biases. So that was to motivate you to follow further when we'll talk about math, because we need a bit of math for this. And so you could have situations where biases are desirable. everything is biased after all. Your model is going to encode a form of bias so that you can learn something about the world. Every model is wrong and some are useful. So we will accept a little bit of those biases. Sometimes we say it represents reality or it makes classifiers better. But even in those cases, if you really want to justify the uncertainty you have, you still need to show it to people to see like, okay, is it acceptable for use cases? What kind of impact is it going to have in reality? So let's dive a little bit into this. So first, let's describe what are we talking about. What is error and biases? And I'm going to approach this problem only from a technical perspective. I'm not going to talk about all human biases. There are a lot of it, not in more than 40 minutes. So, what's an error? A classification error is relatively simple. You have a bunch of items that belong to a class. You classify them, and some will be classified as another class. And this overlap is the errors. It's rather simple. You have an item from class A, it's classified as class B. It looks simple, but what we need to consider is the error direction. Items that come from their true class and they're assigned into another class. Might sound simple still, but so in this case, we can see that it's error from class A to class B. Then we can have other types of errors. So now I'm showing what has been classified in class A. So what is in the middle here, it's good, that's not errors. But we have other types of errors now. Here we have items that don't belong from class A and are classified into class A. And here we have items that belong to class A and are classified into something else. So if you just remember that for today, I'll be very happy because that's really where the complexity of classification lies. There's a difference between items from class A classified as class B and items from class B classified as class A. And those are the things that we need to look at when analyzing those errors and those biases. So what is a bias? There are several definitions. The first one is called an inherence bias, is that in the items that should be classified in one class, you have slightly different items classified in that class. So there is a deviation. Then another form of bias is when you have different levels of errors between classes. For instance, here I have two classes, and here's the classification result. We can see that for the blue class, there is more errors than for the purple class. And we could say that this class is biased against. So when I was showing you the example with the gender classification, you could say that female are harder to recognize. It's biased against female because that class has more errors. Another definition of bias is different levels of errors between groups or subpopulations of one of your class. So for instance, if you try to predict people's emotion and you have a group of female and a group of male, if you make more errors for the female, you could say that you are biased against female. And finally, one last type of bias is when some groups are underrepresented. When your training set or your test set doesn't have the same class proportions as in reality. So it happens in people's detection, for instance, that there are not many female. And so if the class proportion was 50-50, but in your data set you have just 30% of female, you could say that it's biased against female. And the same apply with classes. Maybe you have a class that is more rare or harder to label, or for some reason it's underrepresented in your data set, and the same thing can be said. It's biased against. Okay, now we have some definitions. Now we know what we're talking about, and what we need to do is to measure those errors to identify the biases. And now there will be a little bit of math, but you should be able to handle it. So I want to talk about error rates. There are a lot of error rates. True positive rate, false positive rate, precision, recall, accuracy, And then we could go into F1 score and so on, but just with the simple error rate, where it's a number of error on something, the denominator is extremely important. That's what makes a lot of difference in how you can interpret your error rates. And I'm going to give you an example. Okay, also you shouldn't forget what your denominator is, because a lot of people do. So let's talk about precision as an example. In the case of precision, you would use as a denominator the number of items that are classified into one class. So that's your denominator. And this is where you can have trouble if your class proportion change. So let's take an example with just two classes. So now in my denominator, I have the true positive, so those are well classified in class B, and the false positive, which means that these objects, they don't belong to this class, but they are added to that class. And now we can see in the equation, the denominator has those two terms, the true positive and the false positive. That's how you could see it visually. And now let's make the class proportions vary. Now for class A, I'm going to have more items for class A. And here we can see how that might change the denominator and the numerator. So we end up having different numbers. Let me insist on that. I'm going to do exactly the same, but with bar chart this time. So let's represent it with two bar charts. Here we have the total number of items that truly belong to A, and those ones that truly belong to B. And when we look at what is classified as B, those ones are correctly classified. We missed a little bit. Those are the true positive. And those are the false positive from the other class. So visually, we can represent the numerator and the denominator in the equation. So in the denominator is this bar, true positive, plus this bar, the false positive. And the numerator is only the true positive. And now, let's play a little bit with it. Let's make the class proportions vary. Now I have twice as much as class A. And what you can see in my denominator is that I have an extra little blue bar here. So my precision has changed, but my classifier remains the same. It's just how you analyzed its performance. So if in real life you have class proportions that can change, and that happens in many, many use cases. Maybe you're detecting gender, and at some point of the day you have more male than female, or if you detect people's emotion, at some point of the day it starts to rain and people are more sad. And so this class proportion, they very, very often vary. So the precision will not give you a stable measure over different class proportions. And if we make the class B increase, it's the same story. The precision will change as well. So keep that in mind when you're using an error rate. What kind of denominator did you have with your class proportion changing? And there are other error rates that are more stable if class proportions change. So typically the ones that are used for ROC curves. So here is another type of equation. This time, we're not looking at the false positive, but just the false negative. So those are the items that are missed for class B. And now this little block here is this block there. And if I make the class proportion vary, it remains the same. Doesn't change. And accuracy, finally, it's also another case where if your class proportions vary, your accuracy will vary. So beware of that. And with accuracy, you can also have cases where you achieve a really, really high accuracy, but it can hide underlying classes that are smaller and are, for instance, completely misclassified. So if I had a class that is very, very small and entirely misclassified, that's what you could see here. And in proportion to the correct classification, there will be still quite a large proportion of your total. So that's the second thing you should be careful with accuracy. Okay, now we have some measure of errors, and maybe we can try to make our classifiers better once we measure the errors. That's something called tuning, the error and biases. So I'm going to recap quickly what it is. So we have a test set, which are examples where we know what the true class is, and we use that to measure the errors. So Here we have example of sad faces and happy faces, and we can see how many errors do we have for each class. And to tune the errors, we can use a score, for instance, the probability of being happy, or it could be something abstract, like a happiness score calculated with the angle of your mouth, something like this. And all your images in your test set, they will be attributed a happiness score. So you could see for each of them how happy or not they are. And then for your classifier, you could use a threshold on the score. You could say, I'm going to consider as happy only those that have a score higher than 0.8 or anything. And then you can count your errors. So with this threshold here, I have those errors. And maybe I can change my threshold to adapt my errors. So in this case, if I move it a little bit, I just get rid of some errors, and that's better. But in real life, you could have different class proportions. So now with that choice of classifier, I suddenly have a lot of errors for the sad people if I have more sad people. So if I had this class proportion, maybe I would make a different decision. If I put it here, I trade one error for sad people, the red faces, with one error for happy people, and I have the same number of errors in both classes. That's usually what data scientists might do if you don't tell it if one class is more important than the other. But in real life, it depends on your use cases what's the best solution. So here now we're classifying donuts, and that's a real life use case. My uncle has a donut factory, and he has a donut classifier. So if your donut has a bad shape, he's not going to sell it to you, he's going to put it in the garbage. But in the case of my uncle, if he throws away donuts that are a little bit misshaped, but still okay, then it's wasting food and wasting money. So for him, he might use a different threshold where he would tolerate more of this kind of errors. The little bit damaged donuts will still be considered as okay. And if you're in the medical domain, you also have like other kind of critical errors that you don't want. For instance, you don't want to miss a pathology. If you're trying to detect cancer, you don't want to miss a cancer. So you'd rather have a more false positive, like healthy people detected as potentially having cancer, than cancers that are missed. So that's with tuning the errors that you can adjust that, like these decisions. But to tune the errors, you might need to visualize them. So right now, what experts are using are visualizations that are a little bit difficult, and I'm going to present their disadvantages and then a simplified visualization. So a typical visualization is a confusion matrix. The name is very well chosen. People are very confused. Even experts. And I made a little user study, and these are the main things I found about the problems with it. So cells are difficult to locate and compare. If you have many classes, your matrix is really big, and if you want to compare this type of error with that type of error, it's really tiring. And also, people get confused with what are the columns or the row meaning. And sometimes they swap the meaning. So the columns, they can mean, sorry, I should have explained that, my apologies. So here in this case, in this table, we can see that these are the actual class, and this is the automatic classification. So when I read this cell here, it means that I have 122 items that truly belong to A, and are classified as A. So that's correct. And everything on the diagonal is correct. But here it's items that belong to E and that are classified as A. And with this type of graph, you can see the error in both directions. But it can be difficult to locate and compare the cells. And sometimes you swap the meaning of row and columns. And you might also omit to check the rows entirely or the columns entirely. And I've seen very experienced researchers doing those errors. So there's a risk when you use confusion matrices. And then there is also RSE curves. So now we're using two different error rates, and each point here is the errors that are measured on a different threshold when you tune your errors. And by drawing this curve, it's supposed to help you choose what's the best threshold. Very often, you would want the threshold to be on the top corner because it means perfect classification. But it's never achieved, so you have to make a trade-off between the different types of errors. So if I choose different threshold, different points on those lines, it means I would have a different balance of errors. But how much? How many number of errors would you have in both cases? You can't see it in this graph, and you cannot see either the class proportions. And they're also really hard to read because having rates on both sides, it's very difficult for beginners. The axis is like a third dimension as well. It's also very confusing. And then, whether you're a beginner or an expert, you often forget what the rate formulas mean. I've heard experts telling me, oh, I don't remember, I just look for the point that is closer to the top corner. The denominators are not specified in the labels. They're also quite ambiguous when you're a beginner. So it's true, false positive rates, but rate on what? You never know. And finally, you can't see the class sizes, so that doesn't help you make a trade-off. So to address those issues, I'm going to show you a visualization that I hope is simpler. And we're going to stick to histograms. So those are the histograms I showed you earlier. And so this is where we had errors and items that are well classified. Now we're going to take those histograms and stick them together and shift them. Why did I shift it? Because I'm aligning a few things, interestingly. So I still have both bars that represent the true class, where items belong to. And now everything that is below the zero line, below this line here, is classified in one class, and everything above is classified in another class. And visually it becomes quite handy. So we can identify both what is the true class of items, what is their predicted class, and using this we can visually recompose all sorts of error rates. So I was talking about precision. Precision is this error rate. And the opposite would be that error rate. And for our C curves, the error rates that are stable, regardless of class proportion, you would have to compare this proportion. And also it shows the number of errors. So on the y-axis, it represents a number. So you can have a tangible visualization of what is the mass of people that are going to be misdetected? How many donuts are you going to throw away for nothing? And so when you plot it over a bunch of thresholds, that's how it looks like, and you can see how your bars are going to evolve. The higher the threshold, the more difficult you are, the more picky you are with selecting things, so you end up rejecting everything. But you can see how quickly you're going to reject the positive class or the negative class. And then when you want to zoom in to compare to different thresholds, here you can really see what's the trade-off you have to make. I have this much more of this type of errors and this much less of that type of errors. And that's another example with a real-life data set with a lot more different thresholds, and you can really see, depending on the class proportion, what would be the impact of the different thresholds. You have a question?
How would this relate to classic losses?
Yeah, I'm going to come to that. That's for a binary problem. And so with the user study, we found that it's more intuitive and it helps people cope with the terminology because the labels, true positive, false negative, and so on, are really, really confusing, even for experts. You check in the paper at least a bunch of reasons, like it's really a linguistic problem. But these are not to be neglected, because I could see people, even experts, misinterpreting the errors because they had they were too quick into reading those labels and they confused them. So I made code for this visualization in R, and this is the address where you can find it on the GitHub. And it takes as input a data that is formatted this way. And if you have this data format, it's just one simple line of code.
Yeah, I have a question. You say that removing the bias from a model can only be done by looking at errors, but shouldn't you be first of all look at model specification? Because all these fancy error checking would probably not have changed the classification of the black guy as green, right? Because the model doesn't come up itself like, oh, that's a black guy, that's green. It's probably the data that people saw it's probably the people that looking at those pictures should have been racist, right?
Absolutely, yeah. There's so, like I said, I'm gonna show you in the end how little I addressed in the problem. But indeed, there's a lot of assumptions already. You assume that your ground truth is the truth. And there is a lot of human biases in this ground truth. And that's what I'm showing you is not going to help you find the human biases in the ground truth. It's going to find the biases of a classifier, assuming the ground truth is correct. And the reasons why the classifier has a bias, also this is not going to help you understand why. But if you make different plots of those errors, try to change the parameters of your model, then or your training set, then you might end up having more intuition of where those biases came from.
Yeah, but that's why the first slide is a bit misleading here. Like that shows the classification of a policyholder.
Oh yeah, so that was just to show a larger picture of why we have a problem with classification bias. But with this type of graph, so for instance, here, you could draw those two bars comparing like a group of female and a group of male, for instance. And there you could start to see, look, I have a significantly more errors here or more errors there. So that's just a tool.
But it is bias because I can imagine that there are differences between men and women, black cars and red cars, or scooters or whatever. And it can be harder for one group to measure something and for the other again other errors. But I think bias is also political label we put on something that we don't find it correct when we have that error. But maybe the error is correct or it's harder. So, maybe bias is also being biased by being a political label or something.
Absolutely, that's also like the example of trying to detect people's sexual orientation. That's also, you could say, that's it comes from okay, it's not a policy, but it's the intention you had when you made the classifier. Like I said, I'm really
difficult for a group of men or women, or to find out something, and it is not always that political intention.
Oh, I see what you mean. So it's true that you might end up visualizing the bias, but still not be able to do anything about it. But it doesn't mean that you can try to tweak the classifier until you get rid of the bias. Maybe it's impossible, like you say. But at least if you have visualization that show them, make them transparent and understandable, there can be a shared decision process to see, okay, is it acceptable? Is it okay for a company or society or users to have this level of bias?
So there is no real indication that this set is political bias. You still have to look at it, discuss it with experts and so on.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's difficult.
It is very difficult, but at least when you have a simplified visualization compared to our Z-curve or confusion matrices, you can include more people in a discussion. Right now, it's only a machine learning expert that can really understand those visualizations, those error rates. And should they be the only one making the decisions? I don't think so. Maybe somebody is going to choose something for my uncle in this donut factory that will make a lot of food waste. So that's a negative impact. Or it could be racial and sexist HR recruitment AI. So if you leave it only to a handful of experts, it's going to be, they might make decisions that are also biased because they might not consider that it's important that
will we get then a sort of a stamp, approved, good model, whatever?
Yeah. So
committee or
what I can propose is to put a stamp of like we identify a bias. All the rest that what you could do, starting from there, I'm not going to touch that topic. And I think it might need still 5 or 10 years of research before we could have a label like acceptable. So just to finish with this code, so it works with data format this way, but I also made a little function to prepare your data that works with just two vector of your actual class label and your predicted probability. And that's a more common format, so with this it's going to transform it to be directly usable for the visualization. And there is a little bit more templates on the GitHub, so you could find a vertical version of the binary classification, some visualizations with variants. I'm going to come back to that later. And you can also find a version for multi-class. So in this case, it's the same principle. Everything below the zero line has been rejected. Everything above has been classified in that class, and these are all the classes. We have 43 classes. Try to imagine a confusion matrix for this data set. It's going to be a nightmare. So we made similar forms of histograms. So in blue is correct classification. In black is the false positive. There are items that don't belong to that class, classified in that class. And the red is the false negative. It's items that belong to that class and were classified somewhere else. And with a rollover, you could see where the main sources of errors are. So in this case, for this class, these two blocks in the bottom, they represent false negatives that were classified into one single class, the classes that had most of the false negative. And that's meant to identify which classes are likely to be systematically confused with one another. So here we can see that those items, they come from this class. And those items, they come from that class. And this is the rest for all the classes. And the same goes for the false positive. We can see where they came from. So all the items for that class are classified here in this class, and the other way around. So we can see that there is huge confusion between this class and that class in both directions. But with this class and that class, it's just one direction. It's the false positive from this class classified here. And with the user study, we can see that it's a little bit easier to understand, but you still need a learning phase. So you have the blocks that represents the same item, and you need to wrap your head around that too. It's unusual. And then the legends were pretty difficult to understand because it says that's the first class having most of the false negative. It's a super long label. So there's still improvements to be done, but it's a little bit simpler. And there is also some code for that. There the data format is very simple. It's a confusion matrix. The labels you put on the columns and the row, they don't matter. And then just one line of code and you can plot it, but without interactivity. And for interactivity, I can refer you to D3 code with this visualization. So that's a tool that we made a few years ago. I'm not so sure the code is as clean as I wish it would be, but you have several templates, a bit more than the one in R. So for instance, and you also have an interface where you can upload your data and switch between visualization. So here I uploaded the multi-class data and I can switch to a confusion matrix with the menu on the left. And for binary problem, we have also the traditional visualization with an indication of variance. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. And you can compare two classifiers, for instance, with this menu here. So here I compare two different models for this data set. So you can compare how a classifier works on different data sets and how a data set is classified by different models. And of course, we have also the visualization I showed you. There's a little bit more option. I don't have time to go into details, but there are donut charts. And so now I'm going to talk about more problems that can arise with the errors and biases in practice. So in real life, you would have some users looking at your results. So this is the classification results. We're counting blood cells to make an exam, and the doctor is going to use this classifier and say, oh, I can see things happening in your blood. I'm going to decide whether you're sick or not using this data. And then you can say, okay, I can see the class A increases, the blue class. I can see the class B, the purple class increases too, a little bit, like you can see it here. And then you can say, okay, if my blue class increases, maybe it makes more errors, more false negative that are classified into the other class. So maybe the other class is increasing because it receives more errors from a bigger class. And then if you want to inspect those errors, you need to calculate within the items classified as class B, how many belong to this other class A. And to do that, you need some math to measure how many errors in the end result. And the math is actually pretty old. It comes from the 70s. It was used for other problems in epidemiology before we had classifiers. And just to go through it briefly, there are two methods. One is relying on error rates of the type precision, where like a denominator we might have an issue with. Another, they rely on error rates that are similar to those of RC curves that are stable if class proportions change. So indeed, the method based on precision-like error rates, it doesn't work in use cases where your class proportions differ. So you shouldn't use it in the medical exam I told you about. And so when you try those methods in practice, this is what we're going to see here. Those are the raw classifier results. There were 400 items for each class. And I made a random sample of a test set. And for each random sample, I measured what was the class size. So you see there is a little bit of variance because of the random sampling I did. And then for each sample, if I try to estimate the number of errors and correct the class size, this is the results I would get if I use the method based on precision-like error rates. And ideally, I should have had those 400 per class, but you can see that here I get an even bigger gap for this class here. So it got my results worse. And that's because I changed my class proportions between the data set I use to measure the error rates, so your test set, and the data set I use to measure the errors and correct the estimated class size. So if it has different proportion, I end up with worse results. And if I use the other method that is stable to changes in class proportions, we can see that on average it gives us unbiased results, and that's really good. But we have a huge variance, much bigger than with the other method. And what does that mean? It doesn't mean that this method is not usable. It has bigger variance because your test set was too small, or the data set, the end usage data set is too small as well. So if you use those methods and compute their variance, you can find how to do it in this paper. Then it can tell you, did you have enough ground truths in your test set to have reliable error rates? Can it represent the errors you can expect when you use your classifier? So if you have huge variance, it means like your test set is too small and your error rates are not reliable. So now I'm going to very quickly go through variance. So that's the missing piece. We need variance to assess bias first. So I was saying, if you have a higher level of errors, it's biased again. But what if you start to see what variance you would have among random samples? Maybe there is so much variance that the level of errors is actually comparable, it's not significantly different. And so the variance depends on the class size. If you want to compute it, the variance of an error rate, the formula is known for a really, really long time. And that's the formula you can use in the visualization I showed you about. It's integrated in the error code. And then you should also be careful with what is your class sizes in the data set that you're classifying. If you have a small data set, you're going to have huge uncertainty. And just to go briefly, because I'm out of time, but if you use error rates that you measured in a test set to estimate how many errors you can have in a real-life data set, and you make those estimates and you want to compute the variance of those estimates, the variance formula, you need to account for the variance arising from both the size of your test set and the size of your target set. So I don't have codes for making this math, but there will be a course coming up where we can dive deeper into that and the code for the visualization as well. So if you're interested, you should sign up in the newsletter of my institution, the Digital Society School. And it should come up in Q1 of next year. So I think I'm out of time. So just to come on what have we covered so far today. I just talked about how the classification errors you would have would impact the bias in the end results. But in real life, there are many other factors to consider. So first, what is your data quality? Maybe you apply your classifier on a data set with lower data quality and you would have higher error rates. This is not something I covered so far. And then what was your ground truth quality? Maybe there is bias in your ground truth, errors in your ground truth, or the ground truth is only of high quality or of low quality. And then in real life, there's a pipeline of different software components that are used. Now I showed you how to evaluate one single classifier, but in real life, you would have a first classifier, then a second one, and the errors will propagate from one to the other. And you will need to have a unified test set to test your entire pipeline of classifier. And in practice, it's very rarely done. And finally, you have to consider the conditions of applications, especially for computer vision. For instance, we were counting animals, and depending on where you put your camera to count animals in the wild, you would observe different behavior. So if you put a camera where one animal, one type of species is eating, you will see a lot of that species more than the other. So you're creating a bias in the way you're applying your classifier. And then you could have ways to put the camera that will impact the data quality as well. If it's not enough light in a corner of the ecosystem, you'd have poorer results. So these two I didn't cover, so we have a lot of work to do. But that's the end for today.